Now I'm really excited for this video because we're going to be looking at how to do a full 2D graphic animation. Now I've picked this particular animation, which I've made from scratch, because it kind of encompasses a lot of the techniques that we've been looking at in the course up until this point. What I really want to teach you is how you would basically go from a concept, and it might just be a voiceover or a script, and then create a full animation out of that. And that's very similar to what I'm doing in Module 5, where I give you voiceovers that are already complete and we have to make animations off that. Because at home, when you're creating videos, that's exactly what it's going to be like for you. You're going to basically have a script or a voiceover and you want to create an animation from that. Now, all the files for this I've supplied for you, and we're going to start by just creating a new composition here. And I want to create a new background, so I can just basically create a color here. For this, I'm just using this sort of color here. And I'm just going to call this one background. And this is where naming things is going to be really important. So the next part of this is I want to create these little pop-up buildings for my video. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this overall animation is that I've created consistency in my design. So the first thing I mean by that is the color, right? The color choices, I've basically picked my colors, and we spoke about this in the very beginning. I've picked colors and then made my whole animation work around that. The other things that I've done is also pick similar style of animation. So by that I mean, look at the buildings, right? They're all of a similar design. I haven't just picked real pictures of buildings and then mix it in with cartoon buildings. I've kind of picked a style which works. Then I've built all the elements around that to kind of match that theme. Now this animation could be basically talking about anything, but for this particular thing, it could be talking about deserts and it could be talking about a dry theme, right? So Australia has a lot of deserts. So I've kind of picked this color palette that also kind of represents that, a lot of earthy colors. I've also kept it quite a simple sort of animation. I wanted it to be quite clean. I didn't want it to be cluttered. So that's just a style that I particularly like. It's really about looking at the information that you've got, whether it's a voiceover or a script, and then trying to pick elements based on that. So let's start by dragging in our first graphic here. And I want to start by adding a tint to this. So I can just add a tint onto this, and I want this to kind of match my theme. So I'm using this sort of earthy color here. Again, this can be whatever you like, but it needs to kind of match the theme that you're using for your video. So what I'm going to do is just basically drag this down and recenter it here. And what I did in my original composition was I created a backdrop. So the color can be whatever you like here. This is the color that I'm using here for mine. And I just dragged out a circle. I'm holding shift on my keyboard and I can reposition this here. I want to make sure it's behind my building because we want to, layering things is very important. And I can also just drag this down very slightly here. Now to hide the bottom, an easy way to do this, because our background is not going to be moving, I can just duplicate this, drag it above that layer and then just drag it down. Now, when we're moving the camera around, because we're not going to be seeing that it's the exact same color and the background's not moving, we won't actually see that line there. Now I can just start animating my first image here. So I'm just going to create a position keyframe, and I just want to create a nice little scale up of that building. I want to make sure that this is behind that background layer as well, so that it pops up behind. And I can just right click on these, make them easy ease. And I'm just going to drag in on the graph editor here, just so we kind of get a nice little animation. I can drag out on this to slow it down, so we've got something like that. I can also add motion blur for that composition and also for that layer. So when designing this or the layout, what I'm really focusing on is I'm listening to the voiceover, or I'm reading the script and listening or looking at what it's talking about and trying to basically give the screen that attention of that. Say in this example, it's talking about these buildings. Well, then these need to be the center point of that animation. So don't clutter it with other things. Don't make them really small. Bring them to the front. Make sure they're front and center. Now we could just drag in our next building here, but what I'm going to do is duplicate this, hit P on the keyboard. And with that one behind, right, with this one, I want to select both of those, make sure my playhead lines up. and just drag it or off center it here. Now a quick little tip here is if I drag that building with that layer selected here, if I drag it in holding Option or Alt on my keyboard and just select that, it now automatically replaces it and already has it pre-animated. So I can bring up those keyframes there and I can just off center this because I want it to kind of have a delay. And then I can just go in here and scale this layer up. I can even go to my position keyframes there, make sure they're all selected, and then just scale this down so that we kind of get that little animation. Let's just do that once more. I can duplicate that again, off center this, select those keyframes, drag them across, and then just holding Option or Alt on my keyboard, I'm going to replace it with this building. And then I can scale this up as well. And I can also bring up those keyframes and reposition that there. So now we've just created this whole animation in much less time. So we're looking at ways now to kind of speed up that animation. Now while they're animating in, I also added some text. So I put some text here, which I can just draw out. The exact font and everything, this is where you would basically work out, already have predetermined what that font is going to be. We talked about that in the very first video, and it needs to just kind of match the style. So don't use a completely different font that doesn't really work for the style that you're going for. And to animate it, again, I just use the animation presets. So with my playhead here at the start, I'm just going to drag in the typewriter effect and bring those keyframes up, and I can readjust those here. So we kind of get that animation. Then I can just copy that text, move it across here, and just duplicate it again, and then drag this one across as well. Again, it's just about using animations here, and then I can just off center these animations, right? So the first one I want to come in first, then I want this one coming in here to line up with that, and then I've got my third one lining up with that animation. Again, this really helps when everything's ordered and nicely labeled, because we can just keep track of everything that's going on. The other thing I did was also draw out some little clouds here, just to add a little bit of interest and fill some of this negative space here. So I just drew some cloud designs here, and I just dragged up on this to give them a little bit of a stroke effect. So something like this. I can also create just a very slight animation for those. So I can create a position keyframe here, go to the end of my composition and have this move across. So something like that. So it's got a very slow sort of movement. Again, I can rename this to cloud and then just duplicate that. And if I'm going to move it, I need to select all those position keyframes and then just off center it here. So maybe something up here. And then we've got this little cloud effect going on here. Just something just to kind of draw your eye into this. Now, the other thing we can do that I did in my original comp is I started to basically create an animation of a camera. With using all of these layers, we could use the 3D camera tool. For this one, I'm going to use the null object because I find it just works easier when using this effect. I can basically parent all those layers except for the background layer, because we don't want that to move throughout our shot. And now we've got the controller which controls all of those positions of those layers. Now I created a position and a scale keyframe here, hit U to bring those up. And then I just kind of created a nice little movement here. And then here I just wanted to basically zoom in, bring this down slightly. So we kind of get that little movement there. I can even just reposition this now that I've got all those layers, and we kind of get that animation. I can also select all these, make them easy ease. Now we can go through and adjust the keyframe position and also add speed ramping and everything to the camera movement later. But right now I'm just focusing on kind of getting it all laid out so that we can animate it as we go. Now I went across maybe another second here, and then I want to start zooming out and moving my camera over here. Now we can already see one problem here, which is we've got this background. I can just simply scale this up and move this down just to hide that. But we've kind of got this movement here. Then I can bring in my transparent map here and just layer this on top. I can then scale this right down. And for this one, I just wanted to isolate Australia down here. So I can just create my mask that goes around this, and then we've just got that layer isolated. I can drag up on this. I can scale this up. And another cool little thing you can do with these layers is I can parent that to that null, but I can also make layers 3D even when we don't have a 3D camera. So if I make this 3D, what I also will have to do here is move the anchor point, because the anchor point's all the way over here. So I'm going to move this down into the center of my map. Then I can come over here, and with the x-axis, I can basically rotate this on an angle. Now I have a 3D map without using a 3D camera. So I can basically position it in a three-dimensional space. Now I want that layer to basically animate in here. So I'm going to create a position keyframe here, and then maybe a position keyframe there. And I can just animate this coming in from the side of screen. Can also give this a bit of motion blur. It's going to make it a little bit more interesting, and then just easy ease that keyframe in. Kind of adds a bit more of an interesting effect there. And then I can also add a fill. So I can come up to effect, down to generate, and add the fill effect. And I want to rename this to be my dark map. So because I'm going to be layering these, I want to keep track of which maps are which here. So we've got this first map, and now I want to basically isolate this like I did in my original composition into sections. So where I've got 3 different sections here, I can just simply duplicate that. I can drag in on this. I don't need that opening part. With the mask, I just want to delete that. And now I can draw out a new mask. So for this part, I just wanted to isolate, say, Western Australia here. Then I can change the color of that map. I can then duplicate that. I can grab that mask, delete that one, and then just draw out another section here. And for that one, I can pick another color again. So now I've got 3 sections with 3 different map colors. Now to animate that, a simple way of doing that is under the mask, I can use the mask expansion. So if I create a keyframe here and a keyframe there, with my first one, I can basically scale this down and it creates that nice little fill effect. I'll just show you that again on this layer. If I come down and create a mask expansion, I can basically scale this up and create that little animation. Something else you can also do, which will add to that effect, is add some feather, and that'll give you a soft look rather than a hard edged look. But that's just up to you and the design that you're going for. I can also right click on those, again, make them easy ease, soften out that whole animation. And I can also off center these. That will then change the timing of that animation. Right, so I've got 3 different animations here. Then another little thing I did was also add these little pop-up houses on these layers. So what I can do here is I can come over here and grab my little house image, drag that on top here, scale that down, and just position that wherever I need it to be. I can also add the tint effect to this. So under color correction, I can come down here and add the tint effect. And if I change this color, I can basically make it a similar color to that layer that I'm just working on there. I can also animate this using the same technique we used in the last module. And that is, if I make sure no layers are selected, I can create a new little solid. I can also add a fill to this. I want to layer this now on top of that layer. And I can basically add a position keyframe and just move this down behind that layer. So it creates this little pop-up animation like this. Make those easy ease, and I need to set this. If I go back, if you remember, we set this the alpha matte invert of that layer, so as it goes down behind that layer we don't see it. Also make sure that these have motion blur on, and we need to make sure that these are attached to that null layer, right? So there's a lot of things that's just happened in that little sequence there of animation, but nothing that I haven't shown you already. So really I'm demonstrating how we've talked about these principles and now putting them into an actual animation. The other thing I did was also add a little line to basically come over here from the top. Now we've done this before. If I make sure I've got nothing selected, I don't want a fill effect, and I can basically take my pen tool and draw out a little animated line here from the section that I want. I can hide that mask there, and I can then come down and animate this, right? So under the shape path settings, I can add the trims path. We've done all this before. Just reposition this so I can keep track of where these layers are. And I want to create an end offset here, so that we've got that animation. I might even scale up the thickness on that line. Now, if you remember, we can also add the dashes, make them bigger or smaller, and you can also animate that offset. So if I come back here, I can create an offset keyframe and also come down here and add that animation there as well. Now, if I just select that layer, hit U, I can bring up all those keyframes. And remember, now we have control over that position of that line, right? So we've got an animated line that we can use. I need to basically rename this so we can keep track of what all our layers are doing. And now you've got one complete animation here, which I can also make sure this is on the null. We can then basically duplicate that and just repeat that process over and over again. So I can take those three layers, duplicate them, drag them up, make sure they're on top of my next map here, and then I start moving them across one at a time. So I can grab these two layers, hit P on my keyboard, move this one across, make sure that this layer now is moved here as well. With that house layer, I can now change the color to kind of match that setting. I can even change this color here as well if I want to really make it match to that color. And the line, again, I can now go into the pen tool settings and then basically change this entire position of this line. So we've got that animation now playing out from a different point, but it's much faster because we've already done all that animation before. So let me show you how to do that once more. I take those layers, duplicate it, drag it up on my map layer, move it across, take that house layer, hit P. I'm going to make sure I line up with that playhead there and then just drag this whole thing across. I can change that color to a lighter color here. Also give this something a little bit lighter here as well. And then just make sure that this is also dragged across here. And for the line, again, I can come into my pen tool and then just basically reanimate this line so that it matches to that scene. So we've got lots of different lines animating here. I can even bring up those keyframes if it's too fast and just reanimate that. So you can always go through and retime that. It's completely up to you, and you have full control over once you've done all this animation. You can basically control any aspect of it you like. So we've done a lot of animation there. Let's just go back to animating our camera. I'm just going to add another 2 keyframes in here so we just get a very slight sort of movement of our camera moving back along this position. I can then come into my graph editor and I can start messing around with those positions. Now, where we're getting a little bit of that jerky movement, like we've discussed in this module, we're using cameras. I need to go in here and make sure that the under keyframe interpolation, that these are continuous Bezier. With those position ones, if I come in here, I can also make sure that these, for this spatial interpolation, are linear. And now we can basically control that animation a little bit better here. So I can just drag up on this just to kind of give it a little bit more movement. Maybe just bring this up slightly here, kind of continues that movement there. With this scale, maybe bring this up, maybe bring this one down a little bit here, just kind of adds a little bit more interesting movement to that. Again, if you struggle with using the graph editor, then check out that Facebook group video, which demonstrates how to use the graph editor in a lot more detail. A few last things that I added here into my original animation was I duplicated those clouds, which I had from the top layer. And then I just basically move them down here into that animation. Everything's working off that controller. Another thing I added up here at the top was this big text. I just did that by basically taking this text here, duplicating it, dragging it up. I added a slight position keyframe here from the start to the end. I added the typewriter effect to have it typewriting and also dragged it right down here so that it came out behind this circle. So nothing that I haven't shown you how to do in the previous module or up until this point in the course, but that's how we kind of take a lot of those techniques that we've been talking about and put it into a real animation. So hopefully that's given you a bit more understanding on how we would go from a blank page or a concept into a animated video. In module 5, as I discussed, we're going to give you voiceovers that you can animate videos to. So it's up to you to basically pick a style. I'm going to show you how to obviously do it all from scratch, but we're basically going or working off a voiceover from scratch and trying to time our animation to match those voiceovers. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions on this particular video or any of the other videos in this course, then don't hesitate to let me know.